The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria buzzed with New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of well-dressed executives who gathered for the annual Business Excellence Awards. William Carter stood at his table, adjusting his perfectly tailored Armani suit. His colleagues surrounded him, all eager to be in the orbit of one of Wall Street's most successful hedge fund managers. And now, for our Entrepreneur of the Year award, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. A man who has revolutionized investment strategies and shown unprecedented growth in the past decade, William Carter. The crowd erupted in applause. William rose from his seat, his practiced smile firmly in place. He walked to the podium with measured steps, accepting handshakes and shoulder pats along the way. The weight of the Crystal Award felt familiar in his hands, another trophy for his extensive collection. "Thank you, everyone," William began, his voice steady and confident. "Success in business is about making the right decisions at the right time. It's about responsibility to our shareholders, to our employees, to our community." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, each platitude a reminder of his biggest failure. The faces before him blurred. In their place, he saw another face, younger, scared, hopeful. Lila Thompson, standing in his office 15 years ago, her hands trembling as she held the pregnancy test results. The memory hit him like a physical blow, but his speech never faltered. The scene shifted in his mind. Lila sat in his office, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. "Mr. Carter, I'm pregnant." Her voice had been steady, dignified. William remembered gripping his desk, his knuckles white. "I can't deal with this right now," he had said, not meeting her eyes. "You understand, don't you? My divorce isn't even final. This would ruin everything." Lila's face had crumpled for just a moment before she gathered herself. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Carter. I understand who you are now." She had walked out, head high, never to return to her job as his housekeeper. Back at the podium, William continued his speech about corporate responsibility and ethical leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he pushed through. "In business, as in life, we must always strive to do what's right," he declared, earning appreciative nods from the audience. The rain started as William left the gala. He waited under the hotel's awning for his driver, watching water cascade down the streets of Manhattan. His reflection in a nearby window showed a successful man, silver hair perfectly styled, expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. But his eyes looked tired, haunted. What William didn't notice was the young man across the street, partially hidden behind a newspaper stand. Jaden stood there, his artist's hands clenched into fists, watching the men who had never acknowledged his existence. The rain soaked through his worn jacket, but he barely noticed. His dark eyes, so like his mother's, burned with a mixture of anger and yearning as he watched his father step into a luxury car. The Bentley pulled away, its tires splashing through puddles. Jaden remained, a solitary figure in the rain, his presence unknown to the men who had just accepted an award for excellence. The contrast couldn't have been starker, father and son, separated by a street but divided by worlds of privilege and abandonment. Inside the car, William loosened his bow tie and closed his eyes. The image of Lila's face on that last day haunted him, as it had for 15 years. He reached for his phone, scrolling through emails, trying to lose himself in work. But the emptiness remained, a void no amount of success could fill. The rain intensified, washing the streets of Manhattan clean. But some stains, William knew, could never be washed away. His driver navigated through the wet streets toward his penthouse apartment, where another sleepless night awaited him. The smell of coffee and fresh cornbread filled Lila Thompson's modest Bronx apartment. Every Sunday afternoon, the same group of women gathered around her small kitchen table, a tradition that had sustained her for 15 years. Today, Miss Ruby from next door brought her famous potato salad, while Sandra from the church contributed her usual peach cobbler. "That boy of yours," Miss Ruby said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "he's got a gift. Saw him sketching outside the bodega yesterday. Hands moving like they were blessed by the Lord himself." The other women nodded in agreement, but Lila's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jaden's struggling," Lila admitted, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "Won't talk to me much anymore. Stays out late, drawing. Quit his job at the grocery store last month." She didn't mention finding college rejection letters in the trash, or hearing him cry in his room at night. Sandra reached across the table, covering Lila's hand with her own. That anger he's carrying, it's not about you, honey. You've done everything a mother could do. Everything except give him a father, Lila whispered, the words bitter in her mouth. The room fell silent. They all knew the story, the wealthy white businessman who'd thrown away his pregnant housekeeper like yesterday's garbage. But Lila had never let it break her. She'd worked 3 jobs, put herself through nursing school, made sure Jaden had food on the table and art supplies in his backpack. Across town, Jaden stood on a busy Manhattan street corner, his handmade jewelry and sketches displayed on a worn blanket. The winter wind bit through his thin jacket, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the passing crowd, looking for anyone who might stop, might see the value in his work. A businessman walked past, accidentally kicking one of Jaden's ceramic pieces. He didn't even pause to apologize. Jaden picked up the broken sculpture, hours of work shattered in seconds. His hand shook as he wrapped the pieces in newspaper, trying to hold back tears of frustration. 2 teenage girls stopped briefly, pointing at his drawings. "These are actually pretty good," one said, picking up a sketch. "How much?" $20, Jaden replied, hope rising in his chest. "Oh," the girl said, placing it back down. "Never mind." They walked away, giggling about something on their phones. Jaden looked at his reflection in a store window. Dark skin, his mother's high cheekbones, and eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. He wondered if his father ever thought about him, ever wondered what his son looked like. The sun was setting when William Carter walked past Jaden's display. He was distracted, arguing with someone on his phone about market projections and quarterly reports. His expensive shoe caught the edge of Jaden's blanket, sending several pieces tumbling. "I'm sorry," William said automatically, bending to help gather the scattered art. His hand froze over a ceramic figure, a boy standing alone in the rain, his face turned up to an empty sky. Something about it made his chest tight. Jaden watched the man handle his work, not yet realizing who he was. "It's $20, he said, his voice flat. William looked up, meeting Jaden's eyes for the first time. There was something familiar in the boy's face that made him uncomfortable, a ghost of someone he'd tried to forget. He pulled out his wallet, handed over $100 bill. "Keep the change," he mumbled, taking the sculpture and hurrying away. His heart pounded as he walked, though he couldn't understand why. Jaden stared at the money in his hand, then at the retreating figure of his father. The man hadn't recognized him, of course he hadn't. How could you recognize someone you'd never wanted to see? That night, Jaden sat on the fire escape outside their apartment, sketching the city lights. Inside, he could hear his mother on the phone with Miss Ruby, their voices a soft murmur of concern. He added shadows to his drawing, dark lines that cut across the page like wounds. The sculpture William had bought sat half-finished on Jaden's workbench inside. It was part of a series he called Invisible Sons, pieces that spoke of absence, of spaces left empty by fathers who chose not to stay. William placed the ceramic sculpture on his desk at home, unable to stop staring at it. The figure's upturned face haunted him, something in its expression struck too close to home. He poured himself a scotch, trying to shake off the unease that had followed him since his encounter with the young artist. "Sarah," he called his assistant the next morning. "Find out about street artists near Madison and 53rd, specifically, a young black man, early 20s. He sells sculptures and drawings." He told himself it was just curiosity about the art, nothing more. Sarah's research arrived by afternoon. "His name is Jaden Thompson," she reported, laying out printed photos of various artworks. "He's been selling there for about 6 months. Local art blogs have mentioned him a few times. He apparently had to drop out of the Art Students League due to financial constraints." The last name hit William like a physical blow. Thompson. Lila's surname. His hands trembled as he dismissed Sarah from his office. Alone, he pulled up more information about Jaden online, each detail confirming what he already knew in his gut: this was his son. The memory surfaced unbidden, 8 years ago, passing by the Art Students League building. He'd seen Lila there, looking tired in her nurse's scrubs, arguing with someone at the front desk. A young boy stood beside her, clutching a portfolio. William had ducked into his car before they could see him, but the scene had stayed with him. Now the full picture emerged through his research. Jaden had won a partial scholarship at 14, but even with Lila working double shifts, they couldn't cover the remaining tuition and supplies. His grades had been exceptional, his talent undeniable. But talent wasn't enough in a world where money opened doors. William found himself scrolling through years of local art show listings. Jaden's name appeared occasionally, group shows in small galleries, a mention in a school newspaper, a promising student forced to choose between art supplies and helping with rent. Each discovery felt like an accusation. "I need to do something," William muttered to himself. He began researching art philanthropy programs, eventually focusing on one that supported underprivileged young artists. The Inner City Arts Initiative caught his attention. They provided grants, mentorship, and exhibition spaces. "We'd be honored to have your support, Mr. Carter," the program director gushed during their meeting. "Your donation could fund our entire next season of exhibitions." William signed the check, a substantial sum that would help dozens of young artists. But he knew it wasn't really about them. Every decision was about Jaden, though he couldn't admit it even to himself. He threw himself into the project, attending planning meetings, reviewing portfolios. Each young artist's story seemed to echo Jaden's, dreams constrained by circumstance, talent fighting against poverty. William sat through presentations, his mind constantly returning to that ceramic figure on his desk. At night, he found himself driving past the street corner where he'd met Jaden. The boy was usually there, surrounded by his art, invisible to the rushing crowds. William never stopped, just watched from his car, the weight of 15 years of absence pressing down on him. One evening, he overheard two board members discussing potential artists for the initiative's upcoming showcase. "There's this young man selling work on Madison," one said. "Raw talent, but remarkable potential." William's heart raced. "Who?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Jaden Thompson. His work speaks to abandonment, identity. Powerful stuff." That night, William couldn't sleep. He paced his penthouse, surrounded by expensive art that suddenly seemed meaningless. On his desk, Jaden's sculpture watched him with its rain-streaked face. He drafted and deleted dozens of emails to the program director, trying to find words to recommend Jaden without revealing their connection. Each attempt felt hollow, manipulative. Was he trying to help his son, or just ease his own conscience? The truth was, William realized, he was a coward. He'd abandoned Lila, denied his own son, and now he was trying to fix it with money, just like he fixed everything else in his life. The recognition made him sick to his stomach. Dawn found him still at his desk, staring at old newspaper clippings about student art shows. In one photo, a 14-year-old Jaden stood proudly beside a painting, Lila's arm around his shoulders. They were both smiling, survivors who had learned to thrive without him. The boardroom on the 48th floor offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, but William barely noticed it. He stood before a group of potential investors, his presentation slides showing various artworks from upcoming artists. His hands felt clammy as he reached the slide featuring Jaden's work. "This piece," William said, his voice catching slightly, "represents an emerging talent we've discovered. The artist captures urban isolation with remarkable depth." He couldn't bring himself to say Jaden's name, couldn't admit that the raw emotion in these sculptures came from his own son. "Impressive," remarked Sandra Chen, a major gallery owner. "The artist seems to have a personal connection to the theme of abandonment. What's his background?" William loosened his tie slightly. He's had challenges. Limited opportunities. The lies of omission felt like acid in his throat. "But his talent speaks for itself." "And you're personally backing this collection?" asked another investor, making notes on his iPad. "Yes," William replied, turning away from the images of Jaden's art. "I believe in supporting undiscovered talent." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. After the meeting, his assistant caught up with him. "Mr. Carter, I've gathered more information about Jaden Thompson as requested. His current address is in the Bronx. Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" William stared at the envelope containing Jaden's address. "No," he said finally. "Just add his work to the collection portfolio." He took the envelope anyway, slipping it into his jacket pocket like contraband. Across town, in their small apartment, Jaden sat at the kitchen table with Lila. The space between them felt heavy with unspoken words. His mother's nurse's uniform hung on the back of a chair, still creased from her 12-hour shift. I saw my pieces in a gallery window today, Jaden finally said, breaking the silence. Someone bought them from the street and resold them. They're charging 10 times what I sold them for. His hands clenched into fists on the table. Lila reached across, covering his hand with hers. Baby, your art is worth so much more than what you're selling it for on the street. Is it? Jaden's voice cracked. Rich people walk past me every day like I'm invisible. Just like he did. They both knew who he was, the unspoken presence that had shaped their lives. You are not invisible, Lila said firmly. You are not defined by his absence. Then why does it hurt so much? Jaden's question hung in the air. Why can't I stop making art about him? About the space where a father should be. Lila fought back tears. Your art speaks truth, Jaden. That's what makes it powerful. You're turning pain into beauty. Later that evening, William's car idled outside their apartment building. He sat there, envelope with their address clutched in his hand, watching shadows move behind lit windows. The street was quiet except for distant sirens and the rumble of the elevated train. He imagined walking up those stairs, knocking on their door. What would he say? I'm sorry seemed insulting in its inadequacy. I want to make things right felt hollow after 15 years of silence. Every possible word died in his throat. A young man emerged from the building, Jaden, carrying his portfolio and a bag of art supplies. William sank lower in his seat, watching his son walk past. Jaden's posture was proud despite his worn clothes, his mother's dignity evident in his bearing. William's hand moved to the door handle, then dropped away. He watched until Jaden disappeared around the corner, then started his car. The coward's retreat felt familiar. It was the same path he'd taken 15 years ago, choosing comfort over responsibility. Back in his penthouse, William poured himself a drink and stood before his window. Somewhere out there, his son was creating art that spoke of absence and abandonment, while he hid behind wealth and philanthropy, trying to buy absolution instead of earning it. The envelope with their address lay on his desk, an accusation in paper form. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would try again. But he knew, with a sick certainty, that tomorrow would be just another day of cowardice disguised as business. The Wall Street Journal headline glared from William's tablet, Carter Investment Group under investigation for suspicious art valuations. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. The SEC was looking into his recent art acquisitions, suggesting they were being used to launder money through inflated valuations. They're focusing on the recent purchases, his lawyer explained during an emergency meeting. Particularly the street art acquisitions. They're claiming you're using unknown artists to manipulate value assessments. The irony wasn't lost on William. His attempt to secretly support his son's art had drawn unwanted attention. It's all legitimate, William insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. How could he explain that he'd been buying art at inflated prices because the artist was his unacknowledged son? The truth would destroy what remained of his reputation. His assistant interrupted with more bad news. The New York Times is asking for a comment. They're running a story tomorrow about potential ethical violations in your art foundation. William loosened his tie, feeling the walls closing in. The philanthropic project he'd created to help Jaden had become a liability. Every attempt to make amends seemed to backfire, creating new complications. Across town, Jaden stood outside the Maxwell Gallery, staring at his own work through the window. His sculptures, the ones he'd sold on the street for survival money, were now displayed with elegant lighting and pretentious descriptions. The price tags made his stomach turn, more money than his mother made in 3 months of nursing shifts. They're calling you an emerging voice in urban art, said Marcus, a fellow street artist who'd stopped to look. Man, you made it. But Jaden felt sick. I didn't submit these. Someone's been buying my pieces and reselling them. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, separated from his own creations by more than just a window. Inside, well-dressed patrons sipped wine and discussed his work, dissecting the emotions behind each piece without knowing their true source. They saw his sculptures of absent fathers and lonely children as metaphors, not autobiography. A text from his mother interrupted his thoughts. Baby, you need to see this. She'd sent a link to an article about William Carter's art investment scandal. Jaden's hands shook as he read about his father's art foundation and the suspicious purchases of street art. It was him, Jaden whispered, pieces falling into place. He's been buying my work through intermediaries. The realization made him want to scream. Even now, his father was hiding their connection, treating him like a charity case instead of a son. At home, Lila watched the news coverage with growing concern. Her friend Teresa, a social worker, sat beside her on the worn couch. "Girl, you need to tell Jaden the truth about his father's involvement," Teresa urged. "Before he finds out from the media." Lila shook her head, tears threatening. "How do I tell my son that his father is finally noticing his talent, but still won't acknowledge him as family? That he'd rather face a scandal than admit he has a black son?" The news showed William leaving his office, surrounded by reporters. He looked older, haunted. Lila remembered him differently, proud, untouchable, the men who dismissed their future with a wave of his hand. "The truth always comes out," Teresa said softly. "Better he hears it from you." But before Lila could decide, her phone buzzed with a text from Jaden. "Mom, I know. I figured it out. He's behind the gallery showings." The message was followed by a long silence. In his studio space, really just a converted storage room, Jaden stared at his latest sculpture. It showed a man in a suit, hollow inside, reaching for a solid figure that turned away. He'd created it thinking of his father, not knowing the men had been secretly buying his work. The irony felt like a cruel joke. His art, born from the pain of abandonment, was now tied up in his father's attempt at anonymous redemption. Every piece he'd sold on the street had somehow found its way into William Carter's web of guilt and manipulation. Rain pounded the streets of the Bronx as William's Bentley pulled up to the Youth Haven shelter. He'd heard Jaden sometimes volunteered here, teaching art to homeless teens. The building's fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow through steamed windows. William hesitated before entering, his Italian leather shoes unsuited for the puddles. Inside, the smell of industrial cleaner and cafeteria food hit him. Young faces looked up briefly before turning away, too familiar with disappointment to maintain interest in another well-dressed visitor. "I'm looking for Jaden Thompson," he told the desk volunteer, his voice uncertain. "Art program's not running tonight," she replied, barely glancing up. "Too many leaks in the activity room." William lingered, watching teenagers huddle around charging stations with worn backpacks and tired eyes. Each face reminded him of what could have happened to his own son without Lila's strength. "You know," an older man said, approaching William, "these kids all got stories about men in nice suits who walked away." The shelter director, Marcus Rivera, had worked here for 20 years. "Most of them look just like you." William flinched. "I'm trying to make things right." "Are you?" Marcus challenged. "Or are you trying to make yourself feel better? There's a difference." He gestured to the wall, covered in artwork, some of it Jaden's. "That boy turns pain into beauty. He teaches these kids to do the same. But he's still carrying his own pain." Before William could respond, the shelter's door opened. Jaden stood there, dripping from the rain, a portfolio under his arm. Their eyes met across the room. Time seemed to stop. Jaden's face hardened, years of hurt crystallizing into anger. Without a word, he turned and walked back into the rain. William followed, calling out, "Jaden, please. I need to talk to you." Jaden spun around, his voice cutting through the rainfall. "Need? You need? Do you know what I needed? A father who didn't pretend I didn't exist. Who didn't buy my art through galleries to ease his guilty conscience." The words hit William like physical blows. Rain soaked through his expensive suit, but he barely noticed. "I'm sorry," he managed. "Sorry." Jaden laughed bitterly. "You've been buying my work, inflating prices, creating this whole foundation, everything except acknowledging me as your son. Do you know what that feels like? To have your pain commodified by the same men who caused it." "I was a coward," William admitted. "I am a coward." No argument there. Jaden's voice shook. "You know what's funny? I used to imagine this moment. Used to think about what I'd say if I ever met you. But now." He gestured to his portfolio. "Everything I needed to say is in these drawings. The ones you've been collecting like they're investments instead of pieces of your son's soul." William stepped forward. "Let me help now. Please. Help." Jaden's voice rose. Where were you when Mom worked triple shifts to buy my art supplies? Where were you when I had to drop out of art school? Where were you every Father's Day when I sat alone while other kids made cards and crafts? The rain intensified, but neither man moved. Around them, the city continued its nighttime rhythm, indifferent to their drama. I spent years drawing emptiness, Jaden continued, quieter now. Creating art about absence. And you collected it all, didn't you? Put it in fancy galleries. But you never once looked at what it really meant. Never once admitted why a young black artist might be so focused on themes of abandonment. William stood there, water running down his face, unable to distinguish between rain and tears. Every word Jaden spoke was true. Every accusation landed with the weight of 15 years of absence. These kids in there, Jaden gestured to the shelter, they get it. They understand what it means to be invisible. I teach them to make art about their pain because it's all I know how to do. Because it's what I learned from you, that absence can be turned into something beautiful, even if it never stops hurting. The confrontation left them both drained, standing in the rain, father and son separated by more than just physical distance. The truth hung between them, heavy as the storm clouds above. 2 weeks after their confrontation in the rain, William stood outside Jaden's usual selling spot, holding an envelope. The street was empty, Jaden hadn't been there since their encounter at the shelter. Finally, William spotted him approaching with his usual cart of artwork. 5 minutes, William said before Jaden could walk away. Please. Jaden stopped but didn't turn around. Make it quick. There's a showing at the Hawthorne Gallery next week, William said, holding out the envelope. Your work deserves to be seen properly. Not just bought and resold by collectors. You mean by you? Jaden's voice was sharp. Yes. By me. William forced himself to continue. But this time, I want to do it right. No hidden purchases. No anonymous benefactor. Just your work, presented the way it should be. Jaden finally turned, studying his father's face. Why now? Because I'm tired of being a coward, William replied. And because your art deserves recognition on its own terms, not as part of my attempt at secret redemption. Inside the envelope was an official invitation to a solo show. Jaden's name was prominently displayed, not as an unknown street artist, but as a featured creator. The gallery was prestigious, the kind that launched careers. The curator saw your work independently, William added quickly. I didn't influence their decision. They don't know about our connection. After a long moment, Jaden took the envelope. I'll think about it. A week later, the Hawthorne Gallery buzzed with anticipation. Jaden's sculptures and paintings filled the space, Northwest longer anonymous street art, but a coherent collection telling a story of absence, identity, and survival. William arrived early, standing awkwardly near the entrance. He'd insisted on having no official role in the evening, no mention in the program. This was Jaden's moment. The crowd began arriving, critics, collectors, artists. They moved through the space, murmuring appreciatively at Jaden's work. William overheard their comments. The emotional depth is remarkable. Such raw honesty about urban isolation. The father figures, always turning away. Brilliant metaphor. Jaden arrived with Lila, both dressed formally but clearly uncomfortable in the upscale setting. William watched from across the room as his son was surrounded by admirers, fielding questions about his inspiration. The pieces speak for themselves, Jaden was saying to a critic. They're about visibility. About being seen versus being acknowledged. His eyes met William's across the room as he spoke. The double meaning wasn't lost on either of them. The centerpiece of the show was a new sculpture, one William hadn't seen before. It showed two figures, their faces obscured, reaching toward each other across an impossible divide. The plaque read simply, Inheritance. William found himself standing before it, studying the details. The reaching hands were identical, fathers and sons, but the space between them seemed both infinite and paper-thin. It's not finished, Jaden's voice came from behind him. William turned. It looks complete to me. That's because you're used to looking at surfaces, Jaden replied. The real work isn't in what you can see. It's in what's missing. Around them, the gallery hummed with activity. Critics praised the technical skill, the emotional resonance. Collectors made discreet inquiries about prices. But in that moment, father and son stood in their own bubble of uncomfortable truth. "They're calling me a prodigy," Jaden said quietly. A fresh voice. "None of them know that every piece is a letter to you. Every sculpture is a question you never answered." William swallowed hard. The questions deserved answers. "You deserved answers." "I still do," Jaden replied. Before William could respond, a group of journalists approached, eager to interview the artist of the hour. Jaden turned away, slipping back into his role as the emerging talent they all wanted to discuss. William watched his son handle the attention with grace, answering questions about technique and inspiration without revealing the personal pain behind each piece. He felt a surge of pride, followed immediately by shame. What right did he have to feel proud of a son he'd never helped raise? The success of Jaden's gallery showing attracted unexpected attention. Art critics wanted interviews, local news stations requested features, and social media buzzed with speculation about the mysterious young artist who'd emerged from street sales to gallery prominence. Mr. Carter, a journalist from Art Forum, cornered William near a sculpture. "Your foundation has been instrumental in discovering this talent. What drew you to Jaden Thompson's work?" William's collar felt tight. The authenticity of his expression, he managed, avoiding eye contact. His ability to capture human connection and disconnection. "There are rumors about a personal connection between you and the artist," the journalist pressed. "Would you care to comment?" Across the room, Jaden watched his father stumble through another evasive answer. Each denial felt like a fresh abandonment, each careful deflection another rejection. A young reporter approached Jaden next. "Your work deals heavily with father figures and absence. Is this drawn from personal experience?" Jaden's eyes locked with William's across the gallery. "Everything I create is drawn from personal experience," he answered, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "Some absences shape your entire life." William excused himself abruptly, retreating to the gallery's bathroom. He splashed water on his face, staring at his reflection. The successful businessman looked back at him, but now he could see Jaden's features in his own face, the same jaw, the same way of holding tension in their shoulders. When he emerged, Lila was waiting. She hadn't spoken to him directly in 15 years. "You're still doing it," she said quietly. "Still choosing your reputation over your son." "It's complicated," William started. "No," Lila cut him off. "It's actually very simple. You're either his father or you're not. These half measures are hurting him more than your absence did." The gallery director interrupted them, eager to discuss sales figures. Nearly every piece had sold, many well above asking price. Success should have felt sweeter, but Jaden watched the transactions with growing bitterness. "They're buying pieces about their own guilt," he told his mother later. "Rich white people paying top dollar for art about abandonment, created by the son their friend abandoned. It's almost funny." A prominent art magazine wanted to do a feature story. The interviewer sat with Jaden, notebook ready. "Your rise has been remarkable. Some are calling you the voice of a generation. Who supported your artistic development?" Jaden thought of his mother's sacrifices, the community that rallied around them, the teachers who'd spotted his talent. "My mother," he answered firmly. "She worked endless hours to buy my supplies. She believed in me when no one else did." "And your father?" the interviewer asked. The silence stretched. Across the gallery, William pretended to study a painting, but Jaden knew he was listening. "My father taught me about absence," Jaden finally said. "About how emptiness can define a space as much as what's present. Every piece in this gallery is a lesson he taught me without ever being there." The interview caused a stir in the art world. Think pieces emerged about privilege, race, and artistic inspiration. William's phone rang constantly with calls from his PR team, suggesting ways to handle the growing speculation. "Just tell them I'm a patron who recognized talent," he instructed. "Keep it professional." Later, he overheard Jaden talking to a group of art students who'd come to see the show. They asked about his inspiration. "Art is truth," Jaden told them. "Sometimes the truth is beautiful, sometimes it's ugly. But it's always honest." His eyes found William's. Unlike some people. The tension became unbearable. Collectors sensed the undercurrent between artist and patron but misread it as class friction, adding another layer of irony to the situation. "You can't keep doing this," Lila confronted William again. "Every time you deny him, you're proving his art right. Every piece about abandonment, about fathers who choose silence, you're making his point for him." The gallery's main hall was packed for the closing reception of Jayden's show. Art world elites mingled with critics and collectors, all eager to be associated with the season's breakout artist. Camera flashes punctuated the evening as photographers captured what they thought was the story, a wealthy patron celebrating his discovery of raw talent. William stood at the podium, preparing to address the crowd. The PR team had crafted a careful speech about artistic merit and urban authenticity, designed to maintain the fiction of their purely professional relationship. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite his churning stomach. "Tonight we celebrate an extraordinary talent." A reporter from the Times interrupted. "Mr. Carter, sources suggest you've been buying Jayden's work for years through various intermediaries. Was this part of a planned strategy to inflate his market value?" The room quieted. William's hands gripped the podium. "My interest in the artist's work has always been based on its merit. And the fact that he's your son had nothing to do with it." The question came from the back of the room. Jayden stood there, his voice clear and unwavering. The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras turned, flashes erupted, and the whispers began. William stood frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "I've spent years making art about absence," Jayden continued, walking slowly toward the podium. "About fathers who choose silence over acknowledgement. Every piece in this room is a conversation you refuse to have." The journalists scrambled to record every word. William's PR team moved to intervene, but he waved them away. This moment had been 15 years in the making. "You bought my art through galleries because it was easier than facing me," Jayden said, now standing directly before his father. "You created a foundation to support underprivileged artists because it was easier than admitting you had a black son. Every piece you purchased was another way to avoid looking me in the eye." Lila watched from the crowd, tears streaming down her face. The wealthy patrons shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware they were no longer at a simple art showing but witnessing the collapse of a carefully maintained facade. "Is this true, Mr. Carter?" A forest of microphones appeared before him. "Is Jayden Thompson your son?" William looked at Jayden, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. He saw his own features reflected in his son's face, saw the years of pain and determination that had shaped him into the artist he'd become. "The truth," Jayden addressed the crowd, "is in every sculpture, every painting. Look at the piece called Inheritance." He gestured to his centerpiece. Two figures reaching across an impossible divide. "I created it hoping that art could bridge what cowardice built. But some gaps can't be filled with money or manipulation." The cameras swung between father and son, capturing their confrontation. William's silence spoke volumes, confirming every word. "Your silence now," Jayden continued, his voice breaking slightly, "is no different from your silence then. You're still choosing your reputation over your responsibility. Still hiding behind wealth and influence instead of facing the truth." The gallery erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, photographers jostled for position, and social media exploded with the unfolding drama. The carefully curated event had transformed into a public reckoning. All these people, Jayden gestured to the crowd, came to see art about abandonment. They didn't expect to see it performed live by the men who inspired it. The weight of 15 years of denial, of carefully maintained distance, of guilt masked as philanthropy, crashed down around them. William Carter, the successful businessman who had built his reputation on careful control, stood exposed before the world. The gallery had emptied of all but the most persistent journalists, their cameras still flashing as William stepped away from the podium. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down like a physical force. His carefully constructed world lay in ruins around him, but strangely, he felt lighter than he had in years. "Yes," he said finally, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Jayden Thompson is my son." The admission hung in the air. 15 years of denial erased in 5 words. "I abandoned him and his mother before he was born," William continued, ignoring his PR team's frantic gestures to stop. "I chose my reputation over my responsibility. Every piece of art in this gallery is a testament to that failure." Jayden stood motionless, watching his father's public confession with an expression caught between shock and suspicion. He hadn't expected this, had prepared himself for more denials, more evasions. I discovered his art on the street, William went on, not knowing it was him. But I recognized something in it, a truth I'd been running from. I bought his pieces through intermediaries because I was still running, still hiding from what I'd done. The reporters scribbled frantically, but William wasn't speaking to them anymore. He turned to face his son directly. I created a foundation, funded galleries, tried to help from a distance. But you deserved more than anonymous support. You deserved a father who could look you in the eye and acknowledge the pain he caused. Lila stepped forward, placing herself between them. Fine words, she said, but words don't erase 15 years. No, William agreed. They don't. The gallery fell silent as Jaden walked to his latest piece, still covered, unplanned for the exhibition. With deliberate movements, he removed the cloth, revealing a sculpture unlike anything else in the show. It showed 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a child, their forms fragmented but reaching toward each other. Unlike his other works focused on absence, this piece spoke of possibility, of spaces waiting to be filled. I made this last night, Jaden said quietly. It's called Redemption. He turned to William. I've spent years creating art about what's missing. Maybe it's time to create something about what could be. William stared at the sculpture, understanding dawning in his eyes. It wasn't just an artwork, it was an invitation. The foundation, he said slowly, all of it, it's yours if you want it. Not as charity, not as compensation, but as a partnership. A chance to help other artists tell their stories. I don't want your money, Jaden replied. I want my father. The remaining photographers captured the moment as William stepped forward, tears streaming openly down his face. I'm here now, he said. If you'll let me be. Jaden held out the new sculpture. This is my answer, he said. But we do this right. No more hiding, no more shame. You accept all of me, publicly and privately, or none of me at all. William took the sculpture with trembling hands. I accept, he said. Everything. All of it. I'm done running. Lila watched the exchange, her own tears falling. 15 years of raising a son alone, of answering impossible questions, of filling an unfillable void, and now this moment she'd never expected to see. We start slow, Jaden said firmly. There's a lot of pain to work through. I know, William replied. I'll earn every step. The last journalists finally left, leaving the family alone in the gallery. Around them, Jaden's art told their story, pieces about absence now witnessed by the men who'd inspired them, pieces about pain now viewed through the lens of possible healing. As they stood there, surrounded by the physical manifestations of their complicated history, Jaden reached into his portfolio and pulled out a sketch, his first childhood drawing of a family, complete with the father he'd never known. I kept this, he said, handing it to William. To remind me of what I was missing. Maybe now it can remind us of what we're building. The story of absence had become a story of presence. The art of abandonment had transformed into the art of reconciliation. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning, complicated and uncertain, but real. In the quiet of the empty gallery, father and son stood before the new sculpture, its fractured figures reaching toward wholeness, their own lives mirroring the art that had brought them together.